Greetings, Guardians. In total, there are 308 power weapons in Destiny 2, some of which are exotic, some of which are sunset, but in total we have 49 damage perks. And of these perks, there are also some that just are better than others, to say the least. And I am very frequently asked by people I'm playing the game with on, hey, is this a good roll? And I decided, you know what, it's time for someone to actually talk through each of the perks and explain why they're good and why they're bad. So I'm going to explain all of these 49 perks, explain why I rank them where they are, and talk about why some perks are more equal than others. First and foremost, this is my personal list. Yours could look very different, and if you feel strongly about a certain perk, please comment about it. But keep it civil. I'd rather not have to deal with moderation, especially when I have no clue what I'm doing. Besides that, here's the criteria I am considering when ranking the perks. The first criteria is the general uptime, the second criteria is effective use, and the third criteria is boss damage. These criteria were selected because the main use of a heavy weapon is to deal damage to a boss, and sometimes to deal with a tanky enemy or generally dealing with majors or champions. So because of that, it's important that the damage buff is easy to activate and consistent. At least in my opinion. I will also be going through the perks in alphabetical order just so that it's easier to keep track of the perks. But I don't actually know how to do timestamps on YouTube, so if you're trying to find a specific perk, you're going to have to try to estimate. I'm sorry, I just don't know how to do it. This also took a lot more time than anything else I've done, so if you found it useful, please like, comment, sub. It really helps out the channel, and let's get right into it. The first perk is Adagio. Adagio is a on-kill effect for 7 seconds to increase your damage by 30%. It also makes it so that your weapon shoots slower by 20%. This does make the perk significantly worse, and because of that, I can't put it any higher than C tier. And of course, C tier on this scale is the maybe if it gets a buff section, because if the perk did get a good buff, maybe to get rid of the slower fire rate, even though it would completely contradict the idea of the perk, then it would be usable. The next perk is Adrenaline Junkie, a perk that is not really dedicated to doing boss damage at all, so it's going to be docked heavily for that. But it gives you a buff every time you get a kill with the weapon or a grenade for 4.5 seconds. A grenade kill gives you 5 stacks instantly, and each stack gives a ramping damage buff, starting at 6.7 up to 33.3. So the damage buff is high and its uptime is high. However, the average damage that you're going to be getting from it is probably closer to 13 at 2 stacks consistently. And this is going to be a trend for all of the ramping damage perks, but I think they take too much effort to use them consistently. Next perk is Assassin's Blade, which I'm not going to lie, I didn't even remember was in the game. But on weapon kill, you will gain 15% increased damage and maximize movement speed, whatever that means. And this is a sword only perk, so it's not very good. The next perk in the list is considered to be one of the best damage perks in the game, and that is Bait and Switch. Upon dealing weapon damage with all equipped weapons within 7 seconds of each other, you gain a 30% increased damage for 10 seconds. And this buff duration cannot be refreshed while it's active, but it doesn't have a cooldown, so as soon as it ends, you can just reproc it. And because of that, Bait and Switch has insanely high uptime, being one of the highest damage buffs in the game. It's just, it is the best for a reason, and it's hard to beat it. Following one of the best perks in the game, we have Box Breathing. It's not very good, and it's only on a single heavy weapon to my knowledge, which is the fusion rifle from Bow to Disciple. It reads after aiming down sight for 1.5 seconds without firing for 1 shot. Increase the precision multiplier by 1. Yeah, I think this falls into the Y category. I think it would be completely fine if it did not stop giving the damage buff after you waited that first time. But this is not the world we live in, and the perk is just not very good on heavy weapons. The next perk is actually one of my favorite perks in the game, and that is Chill Clip. And yes, this is not a conventional damage perk, but similar to how Incandescent and Dragonfly and all those are on this list, they do damage once you fully stack their effect or trigger their effect, so I count it. Chill Clip reads that while being above 50% of the base magazine capacity, A direct hit will apply 40 stacks of slow. And remember, once you apply 100 stacks of slow, the opponent will be frozen and then you can trigger a shatter on them. And that's where the damage for Chill Clip comes from. The only weapons that are heavy that can roll this are the Palomera B, the Bump in the Night, and the Fire and Forget Linear Fusion. And I don't think it's actually good on any of them, but it is one of my favorite perks. So I still have to give it some respect, and maybe if it got a buff on heavy weapons, it'd be viable. But it does take your damage perk slot, and because of that, it probably falls into the Y category. Another contender for the Y section is Cluster Bomb. The Cluster Bomb is a perk for rocket launchers that, upon exploding, releases 8 bombs that do very little damage and an AoE around the target. Yeah, I think this might be one of the worst perks in the game for damage, so let's just move on. Next perk is Cold Steel. While Chill Clip got put in the Y category, I actually think Cold Steel might be a viable perk. Well, not viable, but situational for sure. It reads that powered sword attacks apply a slow stack for 4.25 seconds. And the fine details is that light attacks apply 40 slow stacks and heavy attacks apply 60. Now, I don't actually have any sword besides the Zephyr that has Cold Steel, and it's a very fun weapon perk, but I don't know if it is competitively viable, let alone viable enough to put in above anything, but maybe if it gets a buff tier. And in the future, it might. So let's hold out hope and see this perk actually get some use someday. The next perk is Collective Action. For this perk to work, you need to pick up a elemental pickup, so a Strand, Tangle, Stasis Shard, Void Breach, Ionic Trace, Fire Sprite, any of those, and you will gain a 20% damage increase for 7 seconds, and each time you pick up a new elemental pickup, you will increase this duration to a maximum of 12 seconds. Now, this perk is really good for things like Stasis, where you can throw down a single Glacier Grenade, for example, and get a bunch of Stasis Shards for guaranteed 20% damage permanent uptime. Now, if Stasis is ever viable, which, funny joke there, but if it does become viable, this perk's going to be amazing. For the other builds, I don't think they're terribly great, and I should clarify for the Strand Tangles, it only activates upon you throwing the Tangle. So it's not actually that good for Tangle. However, I would say that it falls into the viable category. It has great potential, and 20% damage permanent uptime is pretty good. The next perk is Counterattack. Upon blocking an attack within 0.5 seconds of starting to block, you gain 50% increased damage for 2 seconds. This is a sword perk that honestly would be really fun on a glaive. I'm just saying, Bungie, that'd be a really interesting one. But overall, it's not bad, it's not good, it's very situational and requires a lot of effort to work, but 50% damage increase is very good, so it goes into C tier. Following this, we have Deconstruct, a new perk that has a whole plethora of information written about it. So here's the problem with Deconstruct. Its damage boost is only against constructs and vehicles, and it's only a 40% boost at that. It is very situational, and with the change coming to the reloading of the magazine from dealing consecutive damage, going from being from thin air to being out of your reserves, I think this perk went from being semi-viable to almost worthless. And with that being said, there are times where it is going to be useful. Say, for example, if we get a boss in the future that is only focused on being a construct. So maybe if this gets a buff, but I don't think it's going to be very good for much longer. Next perk is Desperate Measures. It works similar to how Rampage or Adrenaline Junkie works, where each time you gain a kill, you gain a stack. If you get a melee or grenade kill, however, you gain 2 stacks, and then another melee or grenade kill after this will give you 3 stacks. In total, this weapon buff can keep being refreshed, and the damage does keep going up. It's not very good, but it is better than the others. Because of this, I want to put it in the viable tier, but I don't think I can. And this is because of the criteria of boss damage. Using this perk against the boss is just actively saying, I don't want to do any damage, especially because of the weapons it's on currently. So maybe in the future, but for now, I think it has to go into the requires a lot of effort tier. Following this, we have destabilizing rounds. Upon killing an enemy, apply volatile to all enemies within 6.5 meters, and it has a 3-second cooldown. Cool perk, not on a heavy weapon, Y tier. Dragonfly, precision kills cause targets to explode, dealing damage based upon the element in a 4.5 meter radius. Cool perk, not on a heavy weapon, Y tier. Genuine question, did you guys even know this perk was in the game? And guard, readying your sword grants 30% increased damage for 1.5 seconds. Maybe if I got a buff it'd be viable, but I don't think it's very good. At least it's a 30% damage buff, but it's not the best in the game, so it's not going in Y tier at least, I'll give it that. If it gets a buff, maybe it's usable, but for now, it just desperately needs a massive buff. We finally have another viable perk. This one is Explosive Light. Picking up an orb of power grants you 1 stack of explosive light to a maximum of 6 stacks. Each shot consumes 1 stack to gain 100 blast radius and increase damage by a massive amount. For grenade launchers, this is a 60% increase to damage, and for rocket launchers, this is a 25% increase to damage. Because of how good this perk is, it's going in the best in the game section alongside Bait and Switch. Firefly, on precision kill, target explodes, dealing solar damage in a 4 meter radius and granting 50 reload speed for 6 seconds. Cool perk, not on a heavy weapon, Y tier. Firing line, this perk's a bit hard to rank because it depends on the weapon type more than anything else. Being within 15 meters of 2 allies will give you 20% increased precision damage. So it's a pretty big damage boost to any weapon that has a high base precision damage in the first place. However, on like a machine gun, it's not as good. Because of this, I'm going to put it in the viable tier instead of in the best in the game tier. The next perk is a bit of a unique one. This perk is Flash Counter. Upon blocking a melee attack within 0.5 seconds of starting to block, it will weaken the enemy for 4 seconds, making them take 20% increased damage. If swords and close combat encounters become the meta in the final shape, which I highly doubt, this perk could be really good. And because of that, I think it's going to go into the requires a lot of effort, because I don't think it's actually a bad perk. The next perk is Focus Fury. Scoring 50% of your base magazine capacity as precision hits will give you 20% increased damage for 11 seconds. And so long as you keep landing precision hits, you will also keep the buff permanently active. Because of this, the buff's actually pretty good, and it depends on what weapon you're using. For example, on a heavy machine gun, not the best, but on a linear fusion rifle, that's actually pretty good. Frenzy is another really solid perk. How it works is after being in combat for 12 seconds, and just so you know how combat works, so long as you are actively shooting or being shot at or hitting enemies, you'll be considered in combat. So it's basically 100% uptime after the first 12 seconds for 15% increased damage, 100 handling, and 100 reload speed for 7.2 seconds. And the buff can activate well stowed so that when you switch to it, it will be immediately active. And while you keep dealing and receiving damage, this buff completely and entirely refreshes. I think it goes into the viable tier. Full Court is a perk that gives you increasing explosive damage as long as the projectile is in the air. This perk is only on grenade launchers, and it gets the maximum damage increase of 25% after it's been in the air and traveling for 1.1 seconds. This perk's actually really interesting. It has some very, very fun potentials, but it's just, there's not a lot of encounters where you're going to actually get that full distance, and there are just better perks. Because of that, I think it goes into requires a lot of effort here. The next perk is the granddaddy of the stacking damage perks and is the highest of the high rolls for it. Golden Tricorn gives you a 15% increased damage upon getting a kill for 7 seconds. However, if you get a matching grenade or powered melee kill, you will get a 50% increased damage buff for 10 seconds. And this is very good for majors and champions, so long as you have some way to constantly trigger the bonus 50% increased damage, but it is not very good for doing boss damage or anything, and because of that, I think it still goes into the requires a lot of effort tier, but it's probably on the high side of the tier. Harmony is an interesting perk. It's not good on heavy weapons, so it's going in the Y tier, but upon readying the weapon within 3 seconds of getting a kill with a different weapon, you gain 20% increased damage and 15 handling for 7 seconds. It's really good for like a special weapon, not for a heavy weapon. Next perk is Hatchling. Upon scoring a precision kill or 3 kills within 3 seconds of each other, spawn a Threadling at the enemy's death location. Don't use this on a heavy weapon. Headstone. On precision kill, spawn a large stasis crystal on enemy death location. Tier 1 and 2 minor companions only spawn a medium stasis crystal. I don't know what that actually means, and I couldn't tell you if I tried. There is also a 5-second cooldown if you have 5 stasis crystals currently active. Don't use this on a heavy weapon. Next perk is High Ground. It gives you 20% increased damage as long as you are at least 1 meter higher than your opponent at any point, and it does not work while you are airborne, so it's worthless. Let's move on. Unlike the last perk, the next one is actually somewhat viable. This perk is High Impact Reserves. It increases your damage by 12% to 25% based upon your magazine size, and it gives you more damage the lower the magazine's capacity is. For some reason, it also gets nerfed on aggressive frame linear fusion rifles, so I don't know why, but it's a viable perk, and it is most certainly at least usable, so it probably falls in the requires a lot of effort tier. The next perk is one of the best ad clear perks in the game, and that is Incandescent. It applies 30 scorch stacks to nearby enemies when you kill an enemy. Plain and simple, don't use it on a heavy weapon. The next perk is Kill Clip. It can roll on only a handful of old weapons, and it gives you a 25% increased damage for 5 seconds if you reload within 3.6 seconds of a weapon kill. Plain and simple, it is not a very good perk, and it probably falls into the Y category. The next perk is the best of the stacking damage perks in my opinion, and that is Killing Tally. Weapon kills grant a stacking damage buff until stowing or reloading the weapon up to 3 stacks, and each stack gives 10% damage. It is consistent and it is good, and if you're doing it for boss damage, you can use Acting Warrior to automatically reload the weapon without losing the damage buff. Very good perk, and because of that, I'd say it has to go into the viable category. Up next, we have Lasting Impression. This is a perk for rocket launchers only, and it passively grants you plus 50 blast radius, and it makes it so that rockets explode after 3 seconds upon impact. And it gives 25% increased damage. It's not a bad perk. The only problem is that I tend to use it and then watch as the boss damage phase ends, and I just lose out on a whole rocket. But it's a more than viable perk, so into the viable perk section it goes in my opinion. Multi-kill clip is a interesting perk for a heavy weapon. Finishing a reload within 3.6 seconds of a weapon kill grants you 17, 33, and 50% increased damage for 5 seconds. But you have to kill and then reload and then kill and reload multiple times, so I don't think it's that good. I think that it's probably in the Y tier for perks for a heavy weapon. Fun fact, this is the perk that made me want to make this list. One for All is a damage perk that works by hitting 3 separate enemies within 3 seconds to gain 35% increased damage. This perk is good for damage, but it's highly situational, and because of that, it falls into the requires a lot of effort tier. Perk is Onslaught. It's a interesting and very fun perk. It's not a good one though. So how it works is each time you get a kill, you gain a stack of Onslaught for 4.5 seconds, and each stack makes it so that you shoot 16% faster, and at the maximum it goes to 37%. It's not a bad perk, but a very strange one. And because of that, I can't quite say how good it is. It's probably in the requires a lot of effort tier. Causal Affinity is another on-kill perk, but it requires you to get a kill with any source that has a elemental damage matching the weapon. So it's not very good. It's the exact same problem as all the other on-kill ones, and it is too inconsistent, and because of that, it goes into requires a lot of effort. Next perk is a very interesting one, and that is Precision Instrument. I rather like this perk, and I think it's very good. Direct weapon hits grant a stack of precision instrument for 1.25 seconds to a max of 6 stacks. Each time you land a hit, it refreshes the stacks, just so you know. And if you miss, you lose all of your stacks. Each stack gives a stacking damage to 25% at the maximum amount of stacks. It's a very good perk. And because there's so little set for it, I'd say it's viable. Rampage was one of the first ever of the damage stacking perks, and it works the exact same way as Adrenaline Junkie, except you have to get the kills with the weapon instead of any abilities or anything. So let's just move on. It goes into the exact same spot. It requires a lot of effort. So you remember how I commented about Cluster Bomb being one of the worst perks in the game for damage? This is the probably worst perk in the whole game. Redirection. Upon hitting a minor combatant, you gain 1 stack up to 20 stacks. And then when you hit a major boss or a vehicle, you consume up to 5 stacks to gain 20% increased damage. This could probably be buffed up to, I don't know, maybe a staggering 100%, and it would still be completely useless. Oh hey look, another perk that is completely unobtainable on weapons that are only Sunset. Yeah, Shattering Blade is a cool perk at least, so it's still better than Redirection, which is kinda sad. You gain 67% increased damage for grounded heavy attacks that consume all the remaining ammo. At least it's got flavor, but it's most certainly still going to the Y category. The next perk is Surrounded, which requires you to have 3 enemies nearby to gain a 40% increased damage, 35% damage increase for swords, because, you know, the melee weapon needs to be nerfed for a melee focused perk, I guess. And you keep the buff for 1.5 seconds when you no longer meet the condition. This effect is very conditional, but it's actually quite good. So I'd put it in the viable tier. Swashbuckler is Adrenaline Junkie, but for melee, and I am not going to read it all off and explain it again. Same spot. Sword Logic is the newest of these stacking buffs, and it works in a bit of a different way. When you kill a minor enemy, you gain a stack for 5.5 seconds. When you kill an elite, you gain a stack for 7.5 seconds. A mini boss gives you it for 10.5 seconds, and bosses give you 4 stacks. Each stack has a different damage value assigned to it. For minors it's 15, for elites it's 25, for mini bosses it's 35, and for bosses it's 50%. This is actually pretty good, and each time you get a kill, it refreshes the duration of the highest killed enemy rank. So if you kill a elite and you keep killing minors, you'll keep a 25% damage buff indefinitely. With that being said, it still requires a lot of work to upkeep, so it's going in the same category as all the getting kills to gain stacks buffs. Target Lock is a relatively new buff that each successive hit within 0.2 seconds gives you a damage buff ramping up, and when you miss, you lose the damage buff, and it's only on precision hits. Stacks are displayed on the screen as a visual aid, and the buff ramps up with each shot once active, and it reaches maximum at 5 stacks. And these stacks are decided based upon a percentage of the magazine. And to get to 5 stacks, you need to have used 110% of the magazine. Now, there are a lot of ways to cheat the amount of ammo in a gun, but that's up for you to decide and figure out. It's a very good perk, and it's very consistent. Because of that, I'm going to put it in the viable tier. Under Over is a perk that actually was kind of interesting, but I just don't think it's good at all. It gives you increased damage when you shoot a target that has a shield, or an over shield for even more damage. But I just don't think it's a very good perk, and because of that, I'm going to put that in the Y tier. Oh hey look, we've come full circle. It's the final of the elemental damage perk mods, and this one is Volt Shot. Yeah, don't use this on a heavy weapon, same reasoning as the last ones, except for this one it's even worse. You have to get a kill and then reload. I don't want to have to reload my heavy machine gun every single time I want to trigger my perk. Sorry. Oh, how you've fallen, Vorpal Weapon. One of the best perks, now one of the worst. Vorpal Weapon gives a damage buff just flat out to any boss, vehicle, or guardian in their super. However, the buff changes based upon the slot that the weapon's from. If it's a primary slot, the first slot, you get 20% damage increase. If it's a secondary slot, you get a 15% damage increase, and if it's a heavy weapon or third slot, it is a miserable only 10% damage increase. But there's no work you have to do for it, so it's not the worst. Maybe if it gets a buff is probably where I'd put it. The last perk of this tier list is Whirlwind Blade. Powered hits give 3% increased damage for 3.5 seconds, and it stacks up to 10 times. It's a good perk, probably one of the best for swords. I would say it's probably best in slot for swords to be specific. Just like that, that is every single damage perk that can roll on heavy weapons, ranked on a tier list, and I stand by it. I think this is a pretty accurate tier list, so feel free to like, comment, sub if you thought it was good or useful. And if you disagree with the tier list, please comment what you would change and how you would change the perks. Just make sure you stay civil about it. I have been recording this for almost 7 hours now, and I am done. So, hope you guys enjoy the video. Like, comment, sub. Later.